Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on developing a recovery curriculum. My name is Jenny Fox, and I'm the Senior Subject Specialist at the PSHE Association. The term recovery curriculum has been used quite a lot in the last couple of months in teaching and education media, but really the focus of this is that we can't assume necessarily that pupils can simply pick back up where they left off and go back to learning as usual when they return to school. So what we wanted to do in this session is just have a little bit of a reflect on the experiences that they might have had during lockdown, the impact this might have on pupils, and then to start thinking about how we address these through the way we organise learning in the next year. So if we have a quick look at what this session is going to cover, we have about 45 minutes today, and it's just a bit of a starting point to get you thinking about what a recovery curriculum means in your school and what you can do to start planning for that now. So we're going to cover what the key concerns are for young people when they're returning to school, the role of PSHE education versus the role of pastoral care, and then recommendations for immediate, medium and long-term responses that could form part of a recovery curriculum in your school. Not that you necessarily have to take on board all of these recommendations, but they're just suggestions to get you thinking about the types of things you might want to be doing when your pupils return to school and then building into the rest of the academic year. So let's make a start by looking at this NSPCC report. This records all of the responses that were made to Childline during the months of January and April. The vast majority of these calls were in March, 1,600 of them, and these were all of the cases where children contacted Childline with specific concerns related to coronavirus. Obviously, this data is all gathered, as we say, between January and April, so we know that lockdown has continued for several months after that, so it may be that these concerns are continuing to evolve and develop as lockdown continues longer, but these will probably feel quite familiar to the types of conversations you're having with pupils and the concerns they might be raising while they're at home. So the first one and most common issue that was raised by children contacting Childline was in relation to mental health. So young people raised a variety of concerns around mental health, but in particular, these calls often tended to focus on struggling with increased feelings of depression and anxiety, both from those who had been previously struggling with depression and anxiety and also new cases arising, having panic attacks more frequently, having nightmares or finding it difficult to fall asleep or stay asleep, and feelings of loneliness and isolation, which I think lots of us can relate to at the moment. On top of this, there was also lots of comments about the reduced support for pre-existing mental health services that young people had normally been accessing. So whether that was quite formal support from children and adolescent mental health services, or just other trusted sources of support that they were familiar with talking to, like their teachers, their friends, and their family members who are outside of their home. So losing those support networks during the lockdown process and making it much harder to access those was therefore exacerbating other mental health concerns. The second issue that was raised quite highly among children was in relation to their family relationships. So being in constant close proximity with members of their household had created quite a stressful environment, and it had resulted in much more arguments. So again, some of the key issues that were flagged up kind of under this heading were witnessing arguments between parents about financial pressures and job loss in particular. Parents who are divorced or separated arguing about visiting rights and where a young person should be staying during the lockdown procedures, especially when restrictions were much tighter and it was much harder to see other members of the family. Young people having parents who were in the middle of separating prior to coronavirus hitting and the lockdown measures being enforced. So being concerned that the pandemic was going to delay that process and therefore making for a really quite difficult home environment where perhaps parents were still living together but finding it very difficult to cooperate or co-parent. And sort of a slightly separate point, but also related to family relationships, was worries about relatives contracting the virus. So in particular, concerns about elderly grandparents or more vulnerable family members and their kind of health and safety during the pandemic was a key concern for young people. Another issue which we might all be quite familiar with at the moment was that they found working from home quite challenging. So in some cases, being schooled at home had been the cause of other family arguments. Young people were finding it particularly hard to have their day organised by their parents and carers. That was particularly prevalent in teenagers, so those in secondary school. Pupils who were struggling with their work and not being able to access the usual support offered in the classroom. So for those who might find it hard to access learning at the best of times, didn't have those normal support networks like their teacher to explain the work in a little bit more detail, or whether they had teaching assistant support normally in the classroom that they weren't able to access currently. Lots of young people finding it very hard to have a quiet space to concentrate at home, often because of overcrowded housing or having to share devices with other family members, so not being able to access the technology they needed, or a quiet space to kind of concentrate and focus on their work for any length of period of time. Struggling with motivation, just quite generally finding it quite hard to stay motivated, particularly for those students who were thinking about their exams and who had previously been very motivated towards those exam results, and now feeling a kind of a sense of loss around the exams being cancelled. And again, a general sense of concern about future prospects from lots of young people, whether that be in relation to their exam results, or indeed their access to higher education, further education like college and university, or indeed jobs in the future, and worried about their potential job security in the future as a result of the impact the pandemic is currently having on jobs and careers. And then finally, a few other concerns. These were less highly reported, but still very much worth noting from sort of minority groups of young people. So in some cases, bullying was an issue that was quite commonly discussed with Childline. This tended to be at the start of the pandemic and almost prior to lockdown, and often was from young people of an Asian descent and in primary schools who had experienced bullying as a result of a misunderstanding of the pandemic and how it spread, or indeed where it came from, and feeling that they were being ostracised by their social groups, or excluded or picked on as a result of their heritage and the connection with where coronavirus came from. Similarly, ongoing experiences of abuse. So young people who have already been vulnerable as a result of abuse in the home or very difficult family relationships were finding these were much more exacerbated during school closures. And of course, again, they had those fewer sources of support to turn to. So it felt very kind of prevalent for them, a sort of very key issue. And then more widely, the issue around new technologies. So many young people will have been using new technologies like video chatting and live streaming much younger than they previously would have done, and much more often than they might have otherwise done as a result of this pandemic and it being the only way to communicate. So one thing that we might want to think about in terms of the recovery curriculum and pupils coming back to school is that their exposure to online mediums and video chatting like this will have been hugely increased, and therefore the way that they operate online will change significantly. So it might be something that we need to think about adapting into our PSHE curriculums earlier to address some of those issues. So at this moment, I'm just going to pause for a second and ask you to think about all of those that I've just listed. So mental health issues, family relationship problems, worrying about relatives contracting the illness, worries about working from home, and worries about future prospects. And then these concerns as well. Which of those do you think might be most likely to occur in the pupils in your school? Are any of these particularly familiar to you because you've already had conversations with parents, carers and pupils about these? Or are there ones that have surprised you perhaps and that you weren't necessarily expecting to be the case? So I'll just ask you to take a moment's reflection, think about which of these you think are going to affect your pupil population the most. And moving on now, I want to talk a little bit about PSHE and pastoral care and how the role of each of these in the recovery curriculum and indeed in supporting pupils in school in general. So let's take a quick look. Firstly, we have here a little bit of a simplified model of pastoral care, looking at these three key elements. So firstly, keeping pupils healthy and safe. A key responsibility of schools, of course, and that ranges from providing healthy food in the canteen to DBS checking our visitors before they enter the school gates, and now will probably also include providing hand gel and having strict hygiene routines around school to ensure that pupils are healthy while they're in school. Of course, behaviour management is a really key aspect of pastoral care. So that might be that we're rewarding behaviours that we want to see in pupils and maybe sanctioning those that we feel are less positive or that we want to try to amend. And then, of course, our personal and emotional support, which comes through relationships with their teacher or their form tutor. You might also be lucky enough to have a school counsellor or learning mentors in school, heads of year, all of whom are able to provide that personal and emotional support and that sort of one-to-one interaction with pupils. And so when we have that model of pastoral care and all of these three elements are working really successfully, we have our people here in the middle of that diagram, safely protected and cared for and looked after while they are in school. But for us, we feel there is one additional element missing here, and that's PSHE education. And PSHE education works alongside the pastoral care system, although develops that further. So in PSHE education, we're looking at a curriculum subject where pupils learn the skills, the knowledge, the understanding that they need to be able to keep themselves safe, both now and in the future. So that when they leave the school gates at the end of the day, or when they leave school at the end of year 11 or at the end of year 13, they are able to keep themselves and others around them safe, healthy and happy. And that's where PSHE education develops pupils' own skills to do that independently as they grow through education. And so what does that mean in terms of the recovery curriculum and in terms of responding to pupils when they come back to school? Well, in terms of the pastoral care, that's likely to be very much immediate and one-to-one. So, for example, it might be identifying pupils with increased need or vulnerability as a result of the lockdown restrictions that they've been under for the last few months. That will also include immediate, timely and responsive interventions to those particular individuals. One-to-one support for specific needs that are identified from pupils. It's probably going to include hygiene and health and safety routines for returning to school, enforcing those, explaining them to pupils, ensuring that they're followed. Pastoral care is really typified by that personal approach, and it might also include safeguarding responses and managing increased disclosures as a result of pupils coming out of lockdown and coming back to school and sharing their experiences. Signposting places of support and possibly referral on and working with other agencies to support pupils to get the help that they need coming out of lockdown, and building relationships and re-establishing trust, whether that's within the form group or individual class or wider within a whole year group or across the whole school. In comparison, what PSHE education does is provide preventative education. So where pastoral care is often reactive to issues that have already arisen in a young person's life, PSHE education is designed to be preventative so that it teaches young people the knowledge and skills they need before the incidents occur. It's a carefully planned and sequenced programme of learning. So where possible, you want to have your whole year planned out, knowing what you're going to be teaching in each half term and for each year group, and that remains pretty consistent across the year and isn't changed or responded to all of the time by knee-jerk reactions to issues that happen in the playground or things that occur on the news. Instead, we want that kind of carefully planned sequence programme that gradually builds and develops and rehearses skills and knowledge and understanding. It's also universal, so the content of our PSHE education needs to be suitable and relevant for all pupils. It can't only address an incident that has occurred or happened for a small group of or an individual. Instead, it needs to be something that's applicable to everyone and feels right at the time that it's delivered for all pupils. PSHE education is also distanced. So what this means is that it looks at an issue objectively and not from a personal or an emotional standpoint. So even if that's just using characters and scenarios to help pupils think about what that character might do or what might be happening to them, rather than talking about their own personal experiences. And of course, it's about giving young people the knowledge, skills and attributes to manage situations for themselves, both now and in the future. So I want us to have a look at a couple of these scenarios and just have a think about whether we think these are PSHE education or pastoral care. How would we deal with these concerns when pupils come back to school? So in scenario 1, the school learns a week before reopening that a pupil has experienced a family bereavement due to COVID-19. Is that something that we would respond to through PSHE education or through a pastoral system? In scenario 2, staff raise concerns that a number of pupils in the year group seem to be struggling with their well-being now they're back in school. Scenario number 3, pupils are regularly forgetting the school's new hygiene routines. And scenario 4, pupils are getting distracted in lessons and lose concentration. Younger year groups seem particularly disorganised, so they're forgetting their school equipment, they may be turning up late to lessons, they're forgetting their school timetable. So I'm just going to give you a moment or two to have a think about those scenarios and decide, could we best deal with this through a PSHE education lesson, or is this a pastoral care intervention, or could it be a little bit of both? I hope you've had enough time to reflect on those scenarios, and thank you for taking some time to discuss them. We had a few thoughts about these in the association as well, and they are likely scenarios that might well occur. Unfortunately, scenario 1 is incredibly sad and will need some very careful handling. As this is an incident that's occurred for a single pupil, this is something that is much better dealt with through pastoral care. That pupil will need some really intense one-to-one intervention as a result of having experienced a family bereavement. So that might be that you're able to get them in touch with a school counsellor or with grief counselling, or through other services beyond the school, like child and adolescent mental health services, who can support that pupil through this. What would not be appropriate necessarily is to deliver a lesson to 30 pupils on how to manage bereavement with that pupil in the class, because they are likely to find that incredibly personal, very emotional, and quite a hard situation to manage. It's possible you might want to do some teaching about bereavement in the future in your PSHE curriculum, but we would suggest not doing that in the immediate aftermath of pupils returning to school, and instead leaving it until later in the year. For scenario 2, where pupils are struggling with their well-being, this is something that could be responded to in either way. So you might feel that a PSHE lesson discussing some well-being strategies and positive ways to cope with the current situation and to raise their well-being would be really beneficial to all of the pupils in that year group, in which case PSHE is a good vehicle to do that. And we have some mental health lesson plans, which you can download from our website, that would give you some activities and strategies to do that. Equally, it might be that there are ways that you want to reinforce those lessons from PSHE in your pastoral care as well. So perhaps through tutor times or form time, there might be an opportunity to do short, quick wellbeing activities that help to raise pupils' mood and help them to feel safe and happy at the sort of start of their day coming into school. Pupils regularly forgetting the school's new hygiene routines. This is probably mostly best dealt with through the pastoral care system. So it might be that a short, sharp message in an assembly reiterating the hygiene routines and reinforced by all teachers across the school essentially is the best way to deal with this issue. Although it's also possible that you might want to reinforce that with a PSHE lesson on hygiene. Again, however, you might feel that spending a whole hour on a PSHE lesson around hygiene routines isn't as essential at this point, and actually something much quicker to remind pupils of those routines would be more straightforward. And again, pupils then getting distracted, losing concentration in lessons, maybe becoming a bit disorganised. This is something, again, that could probably benefit from a twofold approach. So you could certainly have some lessons in PSHE which focus on promoting learning skills, perhaps encouraging pupils to be a little bit more resilient, encouraging their motivation, helping them to regain some of those skills around collaboration, which they probably haven't been using for the last few months. But equally, again, it might be that tutors or other teachers around the school are able to reinforce some of those quite simple messages around expectations of school equipment and timetabling. So definitely kind of a two-way approach that could be used in scenario 4 there. I hope you sort of had similar thoughts as you were reflecting on these scenarios. So I also want us to think a little bit about what exactly we can do when pupils first return back to school, hopefully in September. When we've been doing some reading around the recovery curriculum and thinking about what this might look like, these 5 levers for building a recovery curriculum have been really helpful and really insightful. So they can be a really good place to start in terms of thinking what pupils are going to need when they come back to school. Firstly, their relationships. We want to create opportunities wherever possible to rebuild relationships. Just like we can't expect them to come back and pick up on their learning exactly where they were in March when schools closed, we can't necessarily expect their friendships to pick up exactly where they left off either. There will quite possibly have been friendships that have been very distant and they haven't had any contact during the lockdown time frame. There might also be pupils who have only had contact online, and we know that sometimes that can quite significantly change the way that pupils behave. Their inhibitions tend to be dropped slightly. Some of the kind of etiquette or behaviours that they think are unacceptable in face-to-face contact, they might readily do in online contact. So it might be that there are some tensions or some conflicts that have arisen in friendships that need to be kind of rebuilt a little bit and dealt with before pupils can move on. And similarly, they might also want to build relationships with their tutor group again or with their class group so that they feel really closely bonded again and safe and happy in school and pleased to be back amongst their peers. Kind of building on that is about the wider community and listening to the needs of our community. So asking the pupils what they feel they need when they return to school, perhaps also having conversations with parents about their concerns about pupils returning to school or what they are looking forward to or what they feel their children need. It might also be that we need to build trust more widely, not just among peer groups, but also trust with us as adults, where we've been for the last few months, and trust with the school as a whole system, and why it's important for them to be back and that this is the right and safe time for them to be returning to school. Thirdly, this idea about transparent curriculum. We know particularly older pupils will have some concerns about the gaps that have occurred in their learning while they've been away from school. For those Key Stage 4 students who are currently trying to work their way through an exam syllabus, they might be really concerned and quite anxious about the gaps that are appearing in their knowledge, about the things that they don't feel they have covered quite so well during lockdown and while they were doing home learning. So we need to reassure pupils and show them that we have thought about this and that we have planned a curriculum which is going to address those gaps and where and how we're going to fill in those elements that they might have missed. And again, give them that reassurance and that confidence that we as the adults planning the curriculum know what's missing, know what needs to be built on, and know where we're going to do that in the following year, so that they can all just kind of start to feel a little bit calmer about what they're learning and when and how they're going to be learning it. Equally, as we just sort of looked at in those scenarios, metacognition is really important. So trying to reignite those skills for learning in very explicit ways. Again, helping pupils to practice their resilience. They might have found it really challenging when they've been doing work that they didn't feel very confident in at home or they found hard to access. They might be coming back with a very fixed mindset, feeling, I'm not good at this, I don't know how to learn, I can't do it by myself. So building that self-esteem, that confidence back, giving them opportunities to try things out, make mistakes, fail, get better, learn from it, is really important. And again, as we mentioned previously, encouraging them to find ways to collaborate and work together because they won't have been able to do that recently. And then just giving them a little bit of space, some time to recover, to reflect, to be themselves and to settle back into school without increased pressure from adults. I think there is probably a temptation from all of us to want to hit the ground running in September and to try and fill in all of those gaps and to rebuild all of pupils' self-esteem and to rush our way through lots of the learning that we felt we wanted to cover in the summer term. But that can feel potentially quite stressful and quite overwhelming for pupils who have maybe only been doing a couple of hours of learning or only been able to access certain parts of the home learning that we've been setting for them. So just reminding ourselves that they need a little bit of time to reintegrate and get used to learning patterns and routines again before we kind of put too much pressure on them. So in terms of our immediate responses and what we might want to do initially when pupils come back to school in September, it might be that we want to do a student survey to find out what their experiences of lockdown have been like. We don't want to assume that we know. Of course, we have information, like, for example, from the NSPCC and Childline report there about what pupils across the country had been contacting Childline about. But for you and your students, you might well want to find out a little bit more about what were their experiences like. For some, they will be delighted to come back to school. Others might be a little bit more apprehensive. Some may have had a wonderful time during lockdown. Some may have had a more challenging time. So kind of pinpointing some of those things and being aware of those issues could be really valuable at the start. Similarly, you might want to consider doing some induction days for all year groups to help reintegrate them and re-establish their routines back in school, and particularly thinking about transition year groups, so pupils who are just coming into year 7, who might not have had the normal transition days that they would, and all of that wonderful transition support that they get in year 6, that might have been a little bit more limited during lockdown. So thinking about how we can induct them into the secondary school effectively. And similarly for year 12, that will be a similar concern, perhaps those year 11s who left school having not done their exams, feeling perhaps a little bit adrift over the last few months, will need some kind of reassurance and building back in as they start their A-levels. We will, of course, in the immediate return, need to do quite a lot about introducing new health and safety systems. That's definitely something that the pastoral care system can do quite a lot of, but it's probably something that has everyone has responsibility for across the school. Focus on building feelings of positivity, safety and community. That might be in quick, short, snappy games that you can do at the beginning of the day that kind of lifts everybody's mood and makes them feel really kind of positive and hopeful. Perhaps considering how to triage disclosures. So we are expecting that there might be an increase in pupil disclosures when they come back from lockdown. So thinking about what can we do in school to increase our support services wherever possible. How are we going to manage these disclosures and ensure that everyone gets the right support they need if they have had a particularly difficult time during lockdown. Similarly, highlighting support services. So even if this is just having posters all over your school about who they can contact, like Childline, for example, if they have concerns and they want to speak to somebody outside of the school. And as just mentioned, kind of adjusting our expectations slightly and remembering to kind of take a calm approach to the beginning of the year. In terms of our more medium-term responses then, I would say for PSHE, particularly thinking about some increased transition work. So what are we going to do in that very first half term with all year groups coming back, but particularly those who've been transitioning to a new key stage or to a new class group? How are we going to really embed good routines, good systems, good learning habits that enable them to flourish in the future? And how can that be supported on the pastoral side as well? Baseline assessments to identify knowledge gaps. We in PSHE talk about baseline assessments quite a lot because it's very hard to know sometimes what pupils already know about a subject because they learn about PSHE through all of their lives. So they might have had very different experiences or seen things on TV or media or had discussions with friends and family about certain topics. So know above and beyond what is kind of identified in previous teaching. There might also be big gaps in knowledge or misconceptions or misunderstandings about certain topics. But in terms of responding to pupils returning to lockdown, it might be that baseline assessments need to be conducted for all year groups and across all subject areas, because we really want to get to the bottom of what have they picked up through their home learning in the last couple of months and where do they need further teacher guidance and support to fill in some of those gaps that they might still have. Thinking about uplifting assemblies that focus on positive messages and hope for the future. That's probably quite an obvious point to make, but we would advise against perhaps focusing on current news issues. I think lots of us are feeling quite bombarded and overwhelmed by news at the moment, and it can all be quite negative. So trying to perhaps steer away from that if that's a typical approach that your assemblies take, or indeed focus on behaviour warnings, because again that can feel like quite negative and a bit of a sort of telling off rather than that kind of uplifting positive message that people probably really need right now. And then also considering developing a pastoral curriculum that can complement PSHE through developing those learning skills, rebuilding and promoting self-confidence and resilience for pupils. And then for the longer term, again, for PSHE, what we probably need in this year is an increased focus on teaching about mental well-being, and then potentially thinking about how to manage bereavement. But again, as mentioned previously, that's something that's much better considered perhaps in the next couple of terms in spring or summer 2021, rather than immediately when pupils return to school. But certainly strategies for positive mental well-being and emotional health can be looked at quite early on and can really promote young people to sort of feel better and be able to have the skills to manage their own mood and recognise that we're going to have quite a lot of ups and downs in the next few months, and that there might still be some quite scary news information coming at us, and how we kind of cope with that as we get back into school life. Amend the curriculum to address knowledge gaps. So in our medium-term response, we spoke about doing baseline assessments and finding out where there might be gaps in knowledge, but in terms of what we actually do with that, we might need to make adjustments to our curriculum plan and what we were intending to cover to make sure that some of those gaps are filled back in. So for example, in PSHE, this might mean that Year 7 pupils need input on puberty much sooner if they've not been able to have quite so much input on this in primary schools, because we know that primary schools often look at puberty in summer term, whether that's either in Year 4, Year 5 or Year 6, but it might be that that top up that we're doing in secondary school needs to be done a little bit sooner than normal, because primarily pupils have the right to know about puberty before it happens to them. So we want to make sure that wherever possible, we've addressed those gaps as quickly as we can. I think also keeping in mind increased pupil need and the ongoing impact of COVID-19 when planning topics for the rest of the year. It might be that with different topics as we get to them, they have a kind of callback to the experiences of lockdown and school closures, and therefore we want to kind of be very mindful of that in our planning. Whether that's just, for example, when we're looking at relationships or friendships, we think about more of those conflict management strategies, or we think a little bit more about online relationships and recognise that they might be using different online tools to communicate now than they would have done if lockdown hadn't happened. And of course, we also in PSHE want to continue to support young people to be critical readers of the news. There's quite a lot of misinformation that has been going around, particularly health information in relation to coronavirus. So helping them to be critical readers and think about whether the source is reliable and how that information is making them feel and the reactions they're getting, and whether in fact they need to take some time away from news sources is also really important going forward. So I hope those suggestions have been helpful. Not that necessarily that you need to do all of those right away, but it might be that some of them have sparked thinking and acted as a bit of a springboard in terms of what you would like to do in school in terms of your recovery curriculum. So again, I'm just going to give you a few moments to think about what your key priorities are based on all of those suggestions or your own ideas. What is there that you would like to do in your sort of action plan immediately on the return to school, in the first term, and then in the next year? If you want to just kind of jot those down, that would be really helpful. And finally, just to finish off, I want to highlight some other useful organisations to you that you may or may not be aware of. I'm sure lots of us have already heard of the NSPCC, and we've referenced them several times today, but they are great for supporting all adults, including parents and teachers who are concerned about young person's safety. We have worked quite closely with Winston's Wish recently. They are a charity across the UK supporting children who have been bereaved, and they include some really fantastic advice for schools, including how to be a kind of bereavement-aware school and how to respond to bereavements in your school community. So we would recommend having a quick look there. You might already be familiar with Mentally Healthy Schools, but they have lots of advice and resources for schools, prioritising mental well-being, which might be something that lots of schools are doing in the next year. I'm sure you're familiar with Childline, but just a reminder that we want to be signposting that to pupils as often as we can. And also you might be familiar with an organisation called Shout. These are a text crisis line for young people in immediate need. They will, if young people text this number, they will be put in contact with a counsellor remotely so that they can sort of text and discuss with them. So this is kind of used for pupils in crisis rather than just those who want to kind of ask some advice, but definitely something that you might want to highlight, particularly if you're working in a secondary school. Okay, and that's everything from me today. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening to our webinar. I hope it's been helpful. Good luck developing your recovery curriculum back in school and in welcoming pupils back into school as they return next year. Thank you. Bye.